Welcome back to the Arsenal Pass YouTube channel. Hayden here today talking about favorite mechanologist, well, except for our Data Doll lovers, Dash. Now, Dash is a deck that I worked on extensively in preparation for Pro Tour #1 in New Jersey. It's the deck that I almost played. The week of was, I would say, probably the deck I was locked into up until the week of. And I pivoted to Chain. I thought, there's a few reasons for this. I'll talk through the deck, but Chain I thought was a good option, then ultimately settled on Kano, sort of basically about 20 hours before the Pro Tour started. So Dash. Now, Dash is in a really interesting spot. I want to talk a little bit about why this hero and why I think it's a really interesting option and why I sunk so much time into it in preparation for Pro Tour #1. And the biggest thing about it is really the flexibility that Dash has as a hero in this meta and in this current format with, Everfest, post-Everfest, new tools as well. And the big thing for me is just the fact that you have this ability to be super aggressive. You have some of the most efficient attacks in the format, using your deck as a resource to get that go again. 0 for 4, 1 for 5, 2 for 6 with go again attached is really powerful. Plus you have the weapon as well. And then you have this flexibility with the items, with Plasma Purifier, with Induction Chamber, to pivot into more of a mid-range or even a control style strategy. Dash can kind of do it all. And that's where I think the power of Dash comes from in this current meta. And the reason that I sunk so much time into it was that I felt that it couldn't not be good. It couldn't not be an answer and a solution for this current format. Now, before I dive into it and talk more about the Dash deck and the fundamentals, the game plans, and go through ultimately the list itself, matchups, etc. If you're enjoying what we're doing here at Arsenal Pass, then please give a like to this video, drop us a subscribe, and if you're interested in our Patreon where we host extra content, we do full sideboard guides for our deck techs like this one here. There will be a sideboard guide up on the Patreon. What comes in and out in each matchup, sort of cliff notes on each matchup. Plus, we have an additional podcast each month and a bunch of other additional content on there, plus access to our community Discord. Now, with that said, let's get in and talk about this Dash deck. With my Dash list that I'm about to break down for everyone through this video, there's two kind of really core plans. Now, I talked at the start of the video about the flexibility that Dash has in this meta and in this format with the cards that it has access to, and that's kind of the core ethos of the deck and the 80 card list that I ended up with, that you have these two kind of streams that you can play with this Mechanologist Dash deck. Now, one of those is an ultra aggressive boost Dash. Now, I think this is kind of the default for me. This is the thing that interests me most about Dash, and that's because of cards like I talked about before, 0 to 60, Zipper Hit, Throttle, Combustible Courier. These decks that have really good stats, even on-hit effects in the case of Combustible Courier, plus the inherent go again by using your deck as a resource to drive this. The other card that I found really, really interesting, and to be honest, I kind of put aside pretty early and then came back to in a strong way, is Teklo Pounder. This card is really powerful. Basically, you effectively start with 6 damage on the board, and if you can get more into play, more damage. And while I thought this was just like a purely aggressive card, this card also has a lot of utility into mid-range matchups where you're trying to find extra damage out of the deck to hit breakpoints. So this card really overperformed for me. Now that's one sort of stream that you go down, and I'll talk through the core of the deck and what this looks like and sort of the card choices as we get into it. And then the other sort of side of it is this real traditional mid-range item-based Dash deck, which uses Induction Chamber as your starting item, plus likes to get out Purifiers and use a card like High Octane to really drive this kind of mid-range plan and have these big spike turns, all while kind of, getting some items out and grinding through that sort of early game. And then mid-game's all about damage and then kind of just taking over the game with those items, which is really strong into, your Guardians. But I'll talk more about the matchups as we get into it. So let's take a look at the core of this deck and what I'm trying to do in each of these two plans. All right, here we are with the core of this Dash deck sitting in front of us. Now this is 49 cards and is basically the 49 cards that you're going to play in most matchups. There's a few exceptions. You trim a few cards here and there depending on the matchups. Sometimes, I'm not playing all 3 Teklo cores, Combustible Couriers, sometimes Make Way. But I'm going to talk through sort of left to right about these cards. Now, the general idea with the core of the deck is to support us to do either of the plans I talked about. And after I go through the core, I'm going to show these plans and sort of the cards that come in and out. And you can see that from the full deck list. But the whole idea is that these all can kind of do one of two jobs. It can both do both jobs rather. So they can either be defensive or offensive in nature. You'll notice all of our blues on the left-hand side here all defend for 3 and are all cards that say boost on them and contribute towards our aggressive game plan, apart from the Teklo core, which in itself is actually a really, really important card in this deck. The yellows, same sort of thing, attacks, 3 block, it's yellow as well, very efficient attacks, and then our sort of damage over the right-hand side here. So from our resources on the left-hand side here, we've Got the cards here, all boost attacks as we say. We go through with throttles, pedal to the middles, high speed impact, zipper hits, 0 to 60s, T-bones. We play one combustible courier, which just rounds out our resource numbers for both plans. And the reason for that is that it's a 2 attack by nature, but it does have an on-hit effect. So it is one of the better ones when you do have Teklo Pounder, but often at 2 attack, it's not really that threatening. We can play some 3 attacks instead in its place. Teklo Core. Now I want to talk about this card, the reason it's so powerful. In our aggressive plan, what this allows us to do is to play it naturally at the end of a combat chain, or off a card like Spark of Genius, and then give us 4 resources over 2 turns, which is really important when we're trying to set up some big turns, and for an aggressive plan because we have cards like Overblast and Maximum Velocity, and Teklo Core is going to allow us to play those. Then, in our sort of more mid-range, that more traditional dash game plan, these are going to allow us to eke out advantage with that extra resource. So it turns that 3 resources into the 4 resources, allows us on turns to sort of block up and then still come in. It's really strong late game when our opponents may be forcing us to block with cards, or we want to start to turn these reds or these yellows, or even some of the blues, into just damage at the face. So we get to come in with our weapons, then we also get to boost in an attack with like a zipper hit, and we have the resources to do that because of a card like Teklo Core. So although this card doesn't defend, it's really strong, and it's one of the best gets we can find off a card like Spark of Genius, and this card is super powerful. So I'm going to talk about Spark of Genius next. This is probably the best card in the deck, I think, just in terms of what it allows us to do in either game plan. So in our more traditional dash game plan, Spark of Genius is going and finding those items for us, those induction chambers, those plasma purifiers. But in an aggressive plan, one of the coolest lines, and one of my favorite lines with the aggro plan, is to actually go attack, boost, whatever it is, maybe 2 or 3 attacks, end of the chain, Spark of Genius, go and find the Teklo Core, which is going to give us those resources for the next 2 turns to have really aggressive turns. Maybe play a card like Overblast. And then we draw up our card. We replace that Spark of Genius with a card. And because of the fact that all our cards in that core basically have boost on them, always going to be a strong arsenal card. Even if it's a blue, it's going to have some utility. Now, the worst ones are like Pedal to the Middle or the Combustible Courier. But even the Throttle's 4 damage, and then the others cost 1 or 0 resources. So a bunch of great arsenal targets in our deck, which is fantastic. A really good place to be. In terms of the yellow attacks, Zipper Hit, 0 to 60, Throttle, they're just the most efficient yellow attacks that we have there. And because we run out of red attacks that we can play, and having yellows in the deck is not that bad. Like, we do want to have some number of yellows, especially the 0 to 60 is really powerful on those big aggressive turns. When we move over to the reds, basically in every matchup we're playing the 0 to 60s, the zipper hits, and the high octanes. Super efficient red cards. We don't play any defense reactions in this build, so our best form of defense is offense, and even in matchups where we're playing the items plan, we're still wanting to attack. We're still wanting to get in damage. We can be really safe early on, so we don't boost away our items. We can go, pistol, maybe with 2 induction chambers out. On that 3rd attack, we can go, come in with a zipper hit. We don't even need to boost it if we're that precious about our items, but we can realistically boost it. We can afford to lose an item or 2, come through with a zipper hit, then in with another attack. And that's kind of our form of defense, is just being on the front foot, being proactive, and I'll talk about that when I get into the game plans, why I think that's so important. I don't really like defense reactions in this build, especially when we're trying to be aggressive as one of our core tenets of the deck. Other than that, you can see in our equipment, we have the Goliath Gauntlets, pairs really well with cards like Combustible Courier, and we do play CNC in the sideboard for Lexi. It is one of our tougher matchups, so we do have access to that card. And then pretty standard Arcanite Skullcap, just defensive capability. Same with Teklo Foundry Heart. Teklo Foundry Heart, really important in our aggressive game plan. Nets as a resource. It's like Tunic every turn. Now, that is using our deck as a resource, and I'm going to talk a bit about that when I get to the aggressive plan, about why that's important and how we have to manage that. But Teklo Foundry Heart, pretty good card as it turns out. And then the Achilles Accelerator, it's got Arcane Barrier for the matchups we might need it, but the main thing is that in an aggressive matchup, we get to gain an extra action point for an extra attack with a pistol, or to play an item out for free without losing our action point, which can be really important. That said, I'm going to move on and talk about the cards that come into the aggressive plan, and then onto that more traditional mid-range plan. All right, and here's the core of what is basically a boost aggro deck. And this is kind of, I would say, plan A with what I'm trying to do with this dash deck. It's what I found has some of the most powerful. It's one of the most powerful aggressive decks in the format, just purely because of the numbers, the cost ratio, and the fact that all your cards can have go again, plus combined with these access to these items that you do have. So this is kind of plan A with the deck, as I say. This is actually 63 cards laid out here in front of me. And some of these cards can come in and out depending on what you're trying to do in the matchup, and I'll explain that in a second. But the main thing here is that we're sitting with 25 blues. These Teklo Pounders come in, take our 22 base blues up to the 25 blue count. Now, with the Teklo Pounders, I don't always play all of these, but we are kind of starting with this Teklo Pounder. That is our starting item into this aggro plan. The other option into a matchup that's, maybe a little bit more grindy, they might have some defensive capability, is I'll still run this core, we'll start with the induction chamber. And what that allows us to do is be like really resource efficient, and also means that we get to save some cards as the resource of our deck. Because with this deck, we're boosting a lot. There is a chance we can fatigue out. That is a big concern with this boost aggro deck. So sometimes rather than Teklo Pounder, if we don't think we can kill them in sort of 5 turns, 5-6 turns, then we bring in the induction chamber. That comes in as our starting item and allows us to grind out a little bit on the end of the combat chain. We can even hedge some plasma purifiers into the deck, which works so well with the high octane. But that's kind of moving from this like aggressive shell towards the mid range. It's almost like a sliding spectrum scale as you can think about it. And I'll talk about some of the key matchups at the end and why these sort of change. But effectively, this kind of core aggressive boost aggro deck we're playing into most decks in the format that aren't effectively decks that can like easily fatigue us out, or we need to grind a bit more against. So decks like Ultim, for instance, something that we wouldn't want to do this against. And then somewhere in between this and that sort of full item build is where we might be for matchups like Prism, for instance. So as I say, this is the core of the deck. The big sort of game plan you're looking to enact is basically these cards here: Overblast and Maximum Velocity, High Octane. These are kind of the power of the deck that comes in with the aggressive strategy. So you can High Octane, boost, boost, boost on your turn, get a lot of things in, and then you come in with a pistol multiple times. A card like Teklo Core is really going to help you set this up. The other one is Overblast and Maximum Velocity. We have all these really efficient attacks. You'll see Red T-Bone comes into the build here as well from the sideboard for this boost aggressive deck that allow you to then pop off a Maximum Velocity or an Overblast at the end of the chain. Overblast is a bit easier to get off, so we play 3 versus the 2 Maximum Velocity, but honestly, not that hard to get a Maximum Velocity out in this deck. You can arsenal it early, get a Teklo Core out, really helps you set it up. Teklo Heart next to that extra resource, and you have a lot of 0 cost and 1 cost cards. So a common line is like you have a blue in hand, 2 0 costs, or 1 0 cost boost card and 2 1 cost boost cards, plus you have the Teklo Heart and the Maximum Velocity. Boom, away you go. You're presenting 20 plus damage really easily with those hands, which is huge. So that's why we have those. Some other hands, you might have cards like Throttle. Hopefully you have 2 0 cost in that instance, or a card like Teklo Core is going to help you out, or you just move to the next turn and you Maximum Velocity on a future turn. Overblast is very much the same in terms of what you want to be doing with that plan. So that's the core of the aggressive deck, as I say, in terms of some of the cards that come out. Teklo Pounder, I will play like 1 to 3. A matchup like Chain, I'm probably only going to play 1, maybe a second one if I'm going first, so that I can find it with Spark of Genius. But otherwise, I don't want these kind of clunky cards that don't defend, that are blues and don't boost into that matchup necessarily, so I'm starting to trim some of those out. Otherwise, kind of this is the deck that I'm looking to play into the aggressive boost style. Now I'm going to move on and talk about the kind of mid-range, more item-based plan. Now, while plan A is this aggro boost dash deck, plan B is moving towards more of these items. You'll see it laid out in front of us here. We've got 65 cards right here. Now, the key ones are these induction chambers and plasma purifiers. This allows us to get these items down early, use our cards to defend out in the early game, to get us these items down, and then starting to chip away. Now, 65 cards here for a reason, because some of these cards aren't coming in depending on the matchup, and I'll explain why. So the Teklo Pounders, we've added these overloops in to boost up our blue count. We're going to take some number of these Teklo Pounders out. Now, that's going to depend on the other cards we take out, but the good thing is these are still blues, and while we don't really want to play them, we will if some of the other cards are dead. Now, what I mean by that is mostly these high octanes. Now, with our plasma purifiers, these high octanes gain a lot of value, but into matchups where they're playing cards like Rampart of the Ram's Head, that shield that the Guardians can use, these go down massively in value, because every time we need to load that pistol back up to come in, we're breaking the chain. So unless we have like 2-3 plasma purifiers, once we get to that second, third attack, now they can just start to pay the resource and block us out completely, and then it's free to defend out that pistol. So these high octanes really start to go down in value versus some of those Guardian decks. So instead, cut 3 of these, cut 2 of the Teklo Pounders, just play 1. Where we play the high octanes, generally I cut the 3 Teklo Pounders and even these Overblasts. I think I want to rely more on the other boost cards and the high octanes to be my plan, but when these aren't in, I do want to have some Overblasts in to allow us to have that kind of, that kind of big hand that we can do an Overblast on the end of it. It's a lot better and more reliable than max velocity when you're on this item plan as well. So that's where we kind of sit on the far end of the spectrum. This is, Bravo, original Bravo. This is Ultim. This is even like Control Starbows. These are the Guardians that you really have to worry about. And then as we move backwards, we start to be in this zone where we can hedge a little bit. And what I mean by hedge is that against a Starbo, for instance, are they going to be this more control-based build? Are they going to be this aggressive, casino type build? In that case, I'll play some number of plasma purifiers and generally just play the starting induction chamber. Now, that's the key thing with this plan, is that we are starting with this induction chamber. It's going to allow us to do the work that we need to. You notice just how good Spark Genius is. In this build, Spark Genius gets us these Plasma Purifiers, these Induction Chambers, while in the other build, we're getting the Teklo Cores and sometimes the Teklo Pounders. So other than that, this is kind of what we're playing, and then we're hedging a few cards. Now, as we start to hedge down into a matchup like Prism, this is where I want to play like 2 of the Plasma Purifiers, not the second Induction Chamber. And that's a big thing because of the footsteps, the boots that we've got there. And High Octane is so valuable against a Prism deck with all these auras. It's just like a reset button. These Purifiers allow us to go over the top, and they can potentially fatigue us if we're just on a pure aggro strategy. So what these items allow us to do is to hedge a little bit. We can still be super aggressive if we need to, but if they start to defend us out and slow us down and try and take a different sort of route, we can start to play our items out and build up a game state and build up a board presence where we can grind through to the end of the game and not run out of our deck as the resource due to the boost. Other than that, as I say, 65 cards, trimming a few down, trying to keep the blues reasonably high, and the game plan is really going to depend on what the opponent's doing. Alright, to close out this Dash deck guide video, I just want to talk about a few things with the remaining cards I haven't touched on, and just some tips and tricks for playing this deck, some of the really key lines that I like to go after, and just a few things to keep in mind if you are picking up and playing this deck. So, first thing I want to talk about is the Command and Conquers. These are basically a Lexi card, to be honest. I don't personally like to bring them in basically any other matchup. There's some argument that maybe you bring 1 or 2 into Katsu, or decks that really want to utilize that piece of arsenal and can't defend that well. But Lexi's the main one because that matchup, well, Ice Lexi in particular, is quite tough. So that's what the Command and Conquers are for. They're kind of a flex spot. If you don't expect Lexi in the meta, go after some other cards. I've tried playing 3 red unmovable, for instance. Hated it. Don't think it's good enough into what you're trying to do versus Starvo. You want to just be aggro, and try and put them under as much pressure as possible. Eat a turn if you need to. Use your equipment if you need to. And then just continue to come back. A card like Teklo Core is really important for that matchup because even if you lose cards from hand, you still have this resource on board. So kind of what I'm looking for, and your damage output is just so high. So the other card is Visiatronic. Kano. Kano is coming up in this meta, of course, post Pro Tour. So I do like the Visiatronic. There is some argument that you can play Visiatronic to make your aggro matches more consistent with the boosts, especially if you're trying to play cards like Command and Conquer in there. I don't think it's quite enough. The cards are really redundant in replacement level that I don't think you need the Visiatronic, and the Skull Cap into those aggro matchups is generally too valuable in my eyes because you are doing some defending. Especially if you draw all blues or you're trying to set up an item, or you just kind of have like 2 blues and 2 reds and you can use those really efficiently, Teklo Heart, which I'll talk about in a moment, then that other blue might be surplus, helps you defend out a non-hit with something like the Skull Cap, so really important. Now, some other cards I want to talk about in interactions that are really interesting. Spark Genius. This card is probably the best card in the deck, I've said multiple times, and also really interesting for what it can do. And the way it pairs with Achilles Accelerator is really interesting. So one of my kind of favorite plays with Spark Genius, as I said earlier, is to play it on the end of a chain, go and get your Teklo Core and set it up for the future 2 turns. But the other plays, you can actually play the Spark Genius basically immediately to draw you another card, replace this, while still getting your item and keeping your action point. And you can do that through Achilles Accelerator. So pitch a blue, come in with your 1 cost, zip a hit, or no pitch, play your T-Bone, come in, boost. Then play the Spark Genius, go find yourself the Teklo Core, or even the Teklo Pounder, although I would say I never really do that, it's the Teklo Core. The resources are so important. Pop your Achilles Accelerator to get your action point back, continue on with the turn, and you draw a card of Spark Genius because you've boosted first. So you replace the card, and you get to keep going. Very strong output, plus you've got 4 resources over the next 2 turns, which is really going to help you power through on damage. One of my favorite plays with this deck. The other thing is that Teklo Core is just a really high value item. It's going to allow you to do the big turns, like I said before, with maximum velocity and overblast. Those resources are going to be really valuable. So this card is very high on the list of things that you want to try and prioritize getting out, even to the point of taking damage sometimes. Make sure you give a Spark Genius for the end of the chain. Otherwise, Plasma Pure and Induction Chamber, in terms of which ones to get when, well, you're always going to start with the Induction Chamber if you start with one of them. Then you want to get a Plasma Purifier. It's just always resource efficient to do so. If you get the Plasma Purifier next, because it's 1 less weapon shot than if you get the Induction Chamber, so you get to save a resource there. And then also, once you go past that, and of course because the Induction Chamber costs a resource as well, once you go past that, it's usually more efficient to get the Induction Chamber next, just pure damage output, but into decks that have Rampart and into the Footsteps, just get another Purifier. Just keep on that plan, and that's why sometimes I'll only play the 1 Induction Chamber and not even bring the second one in because of Rampart and Footsteps getting value across breaking the chain. Other cards to talk about, Teklo Foundry Heart. This card is super important, and you've got to know when to use it and when not to use it. Super powerful, tunic on demand every turn because of the amount of boosts we're doing in that aggressive build and even our mid-range build. But that comes at the cost of your deck. That comes at the cost of things, your resources, your deck, and you can easily deck out if you're using Teklo Heart too aggressively. So it's really important. Play the deck a little bit, work out your spots you need to use it. Sometimes it's really high value. Sometimes that's only going to allow you to do like a pistol hit. And in a matchup where you could get fatigued, that's not going to be worthwhile. Now, In a matchup like Chain, I'm probably Teklo harding every time I get the opportunity because we're not going to run out of cards in that matchup. The match is going to go 5-6 turns maybe, unless I see them pivoting to try and understand that and slowing the game down a little bit, in which case I'll pull back and get off that Teklo heart. Otherwise, Goliath Gauntlet pairs really well with Combustible Courier. Kind of the best target for it, especially into aggro matchups, to really force them out of, like a Husk, or if you've already used the Husk, then just doing damage and getting an extra 3 damage. But in a pinch, you can use it with other cards, and of course with Command and Conquer in the Lexi matchup, that's a great pairing. You can use it with, your maximum velocities, not with Overblast because you're going to break the chain, so use it first, but Throttle, good. And then lastly, the 3 kind of win conditions in the deck, the really 3 power cards that we're playing in the deck. Overblast, Maximum Velocity, and High Octane. Some things to remember. Maximum Velocity doesn't care about the chain, so you can Teklo Heart and then pay for it if you need to. Overblast does. If you're on an Overblast turn and you need to Teklo Heart in order to make the turn work, Teklo Heart straight away. Boost, Teklo Heart. You've lost that +1 on Overblast, but you're going to get the next 2 or 1 or 3 or whatever it is before you play the Overblast, so make sure you remember that. Maximum Velocity, like I say, doesn't care about that. But what you're looking for is 0 costs. You're trying to prioritize, like putting maximum velocity, be really careful. If you put it in the Arsenal late game, it can get stuck there and cost you and just be a dead card. So sometimes late game, I'll just defend with it or even use it to pitch if I need to. But maximum velocity, be careful. If you play it in the Arsenal too late or try and play it from the Arsenal too late, it can really get trapped there. Overblast is a lot safer, and that's why we play that 3-2 ratio. Drawing double max velocity, not very good. Double Overblast, hey, it's kind of fine. And then High Octane. Just that power with Purifiers obviously gets better with Purifiers. So often I'll keep a High Octane in Arsenal. If I have time, get the Purifier out first, and then that's extra damage on top. Just something to kind of remember. I just want to touch on some of the key matchups. I did talk about through some of these through the sort of video, but just to recap where you are playing the sort of boost aggressive deck and where you're sliding along that scale to that more mid-range plan. So into decks like Chain and Briar, I'm really sitting on that aggressive end of the strategy. I'm not playing any of the Plasma Purifiers or basically what I call the time to set up items. Those really I can only afford to play against aggro decks in my view. So those don't come in down there. But as we slide up the scale into something that's a bit more mid-range, a little bit slower, something like a Prism, now I want some items. I'll start with the Induction Chamber and I'll play usually 2 Plasma Purifier. Now, if I don't know what my star of the show opponent is doing, I'll often start 1 to 2 Purify because it gives us that ability to, if they are more mid-range, a little bit defensive, gives us the ability to set up items and not be at the mercy of fatiguing out basically. So I don't mind playing them. They're not super low risk, but they are in terms of the fact they still pitch for red, and if you boost them, they're a Mechanologist card. It's not the end of the world. But the more items you put in, the more you're going to draw, and the more it can clog up aggressive hands, which it's not a boost card, so it does come at a cost. As you move through again towards like the Guardians, sort of maybe even decks like Levia, things like this, up towards the scale. Now I'm starting to look at wanting to play more items, especially against Ultim. That's when I want all my items. Against Original Bravo, I want all my items. And now I'm pivoting the kind of deck that I'm playing. So a bit of an overview of when to play what and how you kind of move up that scale of aggro to mid-range. All right, and the very last thing I do want to make sure I cover, because I know there's going to be questions about it in the comments if I don't, feel free to still ask the questions, is cards that aren't being played in this list and why, and other options you could look at. So I want to start with cards that aren't being played, and there's a few obvious ones. The first two are Signal Jammer and Dissolution Sphere from Everfest. Now, there's a pretty good reason in my eyes why not to play these right now. I think these items are both very, very good. Signal Jammer is great, especially against the Rune Blades that are a ton of double spell. I think Dissolution Sphere, even actually Signal Jammer, very good against Kano as well. But Dissolution Sphere was very, very strong into the Viscerai decks, especially the aggro builds that were obviously coming with Rune Chants. I think that's gone away now, of course, now with Scalata being banned. I don't really have too much interest in playing Dissolution Sphere. And Signal Jammer, kind of for the same reason. I don't actually think it's that good against Chain. I think it costs you a lot. And the only reason I would probably play these items, I play both of them, probably 1 copy of each, is if I was trying to fatigue Chain. I don't personally think that's a very good strategy to be on with Dash. I think you actually have a pretty good matchup if you just aggro them in, start with the Teklo Pounder, tons of damage. They take some time to get warmed up. You're boosting immediately and already presenting them a lot of damage. So I think a much better strategy from my testing, and I kind of avoid the idea of this fatigue and playing those 2 items. Although I could easily see these items come back into the deck if the meta starts to shift, especially if Kano becomes big. Signal Jam is actually pretty good into Kano as well. But those are the reason those 2 aren't in there. And then defense reactions. Got to cover this. Star of the show. I think Unmovable is just not good enough. If you pack your deck with Unmovables, it's an opportunity cost for being aggressive and boosting. And at the end of the day, if you pack your deck full of these kind of Unmovables and Vapor Scenes and Sink Belows, while you can sustain the game for a little bit, you don't actually have enough time to get down all the items and then take the game over. Because they just get to dominate almost, most turns. Once they find a pulse, they can just hold the pulse and just dominate through you. And then plus the Winter's Whale is actually a real pain a 4 damage breakpoint plus that frostbite token is actually massive. And then they just have so many threats that are so relevant. So I don't think it's viable in my testing, but I know people have found that maybe it is possible. I just don't think it's as... I think viable is the wrong word. I think it's viable. I don't think you have as good a win rate than if you play just purely aggressive into it. Because if they do the thing, and they do the Starbo thing, and they reveal and then fuse and do that for multiple turns, not many decks can beat that anyway. So basically, I think that you just want to be proactive and put them under the pump. And if you get ahead, you always have damage. And then cards like Teklo Core are just really important for closing out. Plus, you can hedge into sort of slower Starbo builds as well. In terms of other things I might look at, I mean, you've got Visiatronic for Kano, which covers you off pretty well. But if that does become an option, I'd probably look to bring the Signal Jammer in. I've toyed around with playing like yellow T-Bones as well because of maximum velocity and playing 3 maximum velocity. I didn't love it. I would kind of stay away from that. I think it just actually reduces the average turns you have in favor of a little bit better spike turns. But Overblast does a really similar job. I think it's good enough. Other cards as well, you could look at Payload. I think Payload's pretty good, especially if Prism is going to be in the meta quite significantly. But it is kind of competing with cards like Maximum Velocity and Overblast because it doesn't have Go Again naturally. So I kind of stay away from that card. It could take the space of Command & Conquer if you do have free that up because you're not worried about Lexi. I think Payload could be an option as well. But I think the deck does what it needs to, and I don't really need this kind of Dominate Evasion, I don't think. But I know people are really big fans of that card, so I thought I'd make sure I mention it. Alright, thank you so much for watching this Dash deck guide video. Now, if you aren't already, please drop us a subscribe to the YouTube channel for Arsenal Pass. Drop a big thumbs up and like on the video. And if you do want to check out more about this deck, you can find the deck guide, the full sideboard guide, and notes up on our Patreon Arsenal Pass Patreon, plus all of our other additional sort of goodness content that we've got up there. Now, if you do want to take this into a Pro Quest, best of luck. I think this is a really strong option. I love that you have the 2 game plans. I've played so much with this list. I think I'm still going to run into a Pro Quest, even though at this point I've kind of burnt myself out a little bit on the Dash deck. A good friend of mine and testing partner, Dan Mackay, took this to a Pro Quest this past weekend and put up a top 4 result. The deck is very powerful in its core, and you do have a lot of options available to you. And it is a bit of an unknown. People don't necessarily know how you're going to play and what you're going to do, which was one of the things I really like about this list. But as I say, you've got the deck list here, you've got the deck guide, and if you do want the full sort of sideboard notes and plans, you can check that out up on the Arsenal Pass Patreon. But with that said, see you in the next deck guide video.